It's a great pleasure to have a chance to talk with an old friend, Simon Schaffer. Simon, when and where were you born?
I was born in Southampton in 1955 on New Year's Day. Apparently, I think this may or may not have affected me. The first question my mother asked the nurses when she came to was what the cricket score was, because England were playing Australia on the other side of the world. She was far more interested in that than this child that had just appeared.
Were you the first child?
I was the first and the only child. And within less than 10 months, we left for Australia, not just to watch cricket, but my father was teaching in political science at Southampton University, and my mother was working as a trainee librarian. She'd been a civil servant before then. For reasons it's interesting, I guess, to think back to do with what must have seemed to that generation very clever, London, Jewish, left-wing, LSE trained couple with major political, scientific, cultural interests. Provincial British University in the middle of the 1950s would have seemed, and must have seemed, unpromising and depressing. So they became what's known in the trade as £10 Poms. That's to say they got an assisted passage to Australia on a rather unpromising ocean liner called the Himalaya. The voyage in those days would have taken 6 weeks through the canal. So just before the Suez Crisis, right, this is 55, this is the late 55, and NASA is about to nationalise the canal. And this for a post that my father got in political science at the University of Queensland in Brisbane. And I spent the next decade in Brisbane. My mother became a librarian at the university, and my father became a professor in political science and in the nascent discipline of development studies. So he did a lot of work in New Guinea, in the Highlands, and elsewhere in the South Pacific, but mainly in New Guinea. And I remember extremely well going to what obviously then was a terribly exciting place, Brisbane Airport, late 1950s, watching my father fly off to the unknown north, and coming back with souvenirs and objects and maps and pictures of the most extraordinary other world, sea-picked shields and amazingly carved spears, amazing, which we've still got some, and deep suntan, the knee-high white socks, the beard that of course goes along with that sort of field work at that sort of time. But this is not anthropology, though there were lots of anthropologists around in those days. It was very much political science turning itself into a kind of development studies, and I guess even for a child that was an interesting question. And this was during the period of transition, that's to say this was an Australian administered territory, PNG, at this period. And there was a lot of cricket, and there was a lot of swimming, and there was always a cricket match on Christmas Day in temperatures of slightly over 95 degrees Fahrenheit. There had to be Christmas pudding. And the
Father
dog,
Christmas.
And
Father Christmas.
And Father Christmas. And the dog, because we always had a dog, was always the wicketkeeper. Rather ineffective, but still pretty good. And we, by this stage, we're in the late 50s, early 60s, so that I'm 4 or 5 years old. They built their own house on what was then the outskirts of Brisbane, a clearing in the bush with gum trees as far as the eye could see, and a creek ran through it, and goannas, big lizards, who lived next to the creek, and no mains drainage, so a septic tank, which was fantastic because you could grow papyrus in the septic tank. And I remember, trying to make paper out of the papyrus and cutting it down, and pasting it out, and putting it in the sun to dry. That was my first experience of reenactment. And really a halcyon period. I mean, I think if you're a relatively active child, suburban white Brisbane in the period of the Cold War was as near heaven as you were likely to get. Looking back on it, there were all sorts of blindnesses. There was a complete blindness, and my mother and I have much spoken about this, about Aboriginal society. I'm probably wrong about this, but I think that at this stage, for example, Aborigines were not allowed to live north of the Brisbane River. There's this very large river that flows through the city and divides it in two, and it was essentially like Alabama. I mean, there was internal control of that sort. There was a Salvation Army school next to my primary school, which had some Aboriginal children in it, and they came to our school. But they were very tightly controlled, and the quotidian racism of the society went from, I think, the white point of view, absolutely unmarked. So in every other respect, I was brought up in a socialist household, and this was invisible. And in retrospect, that's very, very interesting. The other thing that's quite striking, perhaps, is how little one travelled. Right? This was still a world of immense distance. So you got from Australia to Britain on a boat, of course. When we came back, we came on a P&O boat, again through the canal. Since we were obviously the storm crows of world politics, this was one of the last boats through the canal before the '67 war. We couldn't land in Aden because in '65 because of the fighting in Aden that culminated with the British being thrown out. So that meant we had longer in Egypt, so we were able to go to the pyramids and so on. It was a world which still looked in all sorts of ways colonial, of course. And the waiters on the boats were from Goa. As I said, there was Christmas pudding at Christmas because it was Christmas, right? Even though meteorologically this was a complete disaster. If you went to Sydney, you went on the train, amazingly. And the gauge changes at the border between Queensland and New South Wales, and what I remember very well, these midnight unpleasantnesses of getting out of your sleeper and walking across the platform at Armidale or somewhere, so you could get on another train with a slightly broader gauge because the guys in New South Wales had broad gauge trains and so on. So a world now immemorially ancient, after all. And I think that also is quite important to think about, that very recent history, and certainly very recent in terms of generations, can take you to a place where technology and culture and expectation and assumption are utterly alien. A good LP Hartley thought, right? They do things differently there. But on the whole, absolutely blissful childhood. Nothing to complain about, except the mosquitoes, which I hated, and the fact that primary education in Cold War Queensland was entirely 19th century, as I now realise. One was taught copperplate with a nib pen and inkwells, good, solid, dark blue Indian ink. And I hated that every Monday night because I'd blot my homework, and Mum and Dad had to kind of console me when I had to write it all out again. There was a lot of mental arithmetic and learning by rote. There was a lot of colonial history learned. Right? We learnt more about the Wars of the Roses than we did about in Brisbane in 1958, than we did, let's say, about what archaeologists were finding about the human history of Australia. Right? Australian history, as far as we were taught, began in 1788 with this little prelude with Cook. But essentially the arrival of the First Fleet in January of 1788 was the beginning of history for us. And then there was this other stuff that happened in Europe, and that was it. Right? And the primary school was divided into houses, of course, and each house was named after a heroic Australian explorer: Cook, Flinders, Oxley, Sturt, people like that, who had opened up this unknown world. So that was the vision. Right? And then every, I guess, Thursday evening, the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, which was our sole source of news, really, there was no television in my house.
There weren't many televisions in anyone's house, I
No,
think, at that time.
no. I can remember our first telly, it would be in the mid-60s. ABC would broadcast a short program called Window on the West, with appropriate music underneath, which was entirely oriented towards what was obviously beginning to affect us more and more. I can remember Dag Hammarskjöld's death being reported in the Congo. I can remember the beginning of the Vietnam War, and the Australians were going to enter the war on the American side. And I can remember the Cuban Missile Crisis of '62, '7. But absolutely oriented towards a kind of Anglo-American world, right? Not, as it were, towards where Australia is. It was a Commonwealth worldview.
Can I just go back a little bit?
Mm-hmm.
Some people go back beyond their parents
Mm-hmm.
to grandparents and where they came from.
Mm-hmm.
Is it worth saying that in your case? Did you know your grandparents?
I knew my mother's parents. I mean, that's a sadness about the family, which is that both my father's parents died while we were in Australia, so that I never met them. I mean, obviously I met them when I was less than one. And I'm, in that sense, my father's side of the family was kind of unknown. On the other hand, he had two sisters, one of whom is very much still with us, who were my closest relatives when we returned to Britain, were very important for me.
What sort of family?
These are, I mean, these were good, solid London, lower middle class Jewish family.
Originally from?
Originally from Lithuania, mainly. And Vilna, right? Who had, so their parents had left around about the time of the 1905 revolution and the pogroms of that period.
It's the same background as Sidney Brenner and
Yeah, I mean,
Aaron
this is
Klug.
the standard story.
Yeah.
I was told, I feel, I may be wrong about this, comparatively little to nothing whatsoever about all this. There had been family in the Netherlands, most of whom had been murdered by the Nazis, though some had survived, and we met them, and they're very dear to us. There was obviously a very extended family in North London who looked after us when we came back to England for the first time, who were very close cousins and so on. My sense was that my father was treated as the absolutely delightful, entirely eccentric, often inexplicably intellectual member of an otherwise very, very solid family, that every generation one had to produce what in Yiddish is called a hacham, which comes from the Hebrew word for learned, right? But it has that nuance of cannot tie up his shoelaces or indeed navigate his way around the world. And Yiddish has many words for that character for obvious reasons. Melamed, and Nebish, Shlemiel, and so What's the difference between a nevish and a shlemiel? When a shlemiel drops his toast, it always lands on the buttered side, and the nevish butters both sides. So you might bring these disasters upon yourself, but in general they happen to you. Nevertheless, given how Jewish, especially Ashkenazi Jewish culture had developed, there was a very strong sense that you had to have such a person around, right? You know, that there had to be at least one clever boy in the family. And I think there was some kind of expectation that that was going to be me, right?
And your mother's side?
Mum's father was a shoe salesman, and a very, very good one, who was from South London, and therefore a Surrey supporter, unlike the rest of the family. That was a source of some tension. And he was an adorable man, whom I miss enormously, who was one of the most benevolent people I've ever seen or met. I mean, just everything was fine. He was brilliant at selling shoes, evidently, and he'd retired long before I met him. And his wife, my mother's mother, also absolutely delightful. They moved to, essentially been evacuated to Torquay during the war, which is where my mum grew up and where she went to secondary school. Right? Torquay Grammar School for Girls. So that had sort of taken them into a different world, right? And they'd retired to Bournemouth, so not London, right? And that seemed pretty exotic, right, for the family, I think. We used to travel to Bournemouth to visit them at regular intervals.
I sometimes pick up things out of sequence, and quite a lot of, well, a certain amount of this has been about your Jewish background. I've been watching a series on television about Jews. It might be nice just to reflect, if you had anything more to say about whether that, in what ways, apart from being expected to be the clever one, what other ways it might have influenced you?
Yeah, I've thought about that a bit. I mean, certainly I would say at least these two things. I mean, one is the sense of observing things from the side, of being absolutely assimilated without being a member, of trying to think of a slightly different perspective, on noticing perhaps a little more, only a little more, quickly what's being taken for granted here, right? Because if one, almost by definition, doesn't share quite all the assumptions of the group, which you are nevertheless completely absorbed with it, right? It's why, you know, I mean, I wouldn't dream of claiming the equivalent role that, say, cricket plays for C.L.R. James, right? But it's obvious that there's a relation between, you know, in what I'm reminiscing about, between cricket and Judaism in this very interesting way. Absolutely absorbed, absolutely not, right? Looking at things slightly from one side, but being completely assimilated within a culture. These are assimilated and essentially secularized.
There was no religious observance.
There is religious observance, but this is a culture, and many people have commented on this, which can be entirely observant in religious terms. There are rabbis in my ancestry, and some very eminent ones, without actually having, as it were, belief. Right?
Church of England. No.
Exactly. Exactly. The old Christopher Hill anecdote. Is it Christopher Hill, I think? At Sarge, there's a guy here who says he's an atheist. I'll put him down, C of E. It's a bit like that. So, family life absolutely absorbed by the synagogue, by bar mitzvahs. I was bar mitzvah. By all sorts of rituals, Passover dinner, and so on, without it ever seemed to me having any, or at least hardly any, correlative belief in anything, of the theological or spiritual kind. I mean, this was absolutely phenomenological Judaism, right? And I think that's a very dominant pattern indeed, because maintaining the culture is maintaining the faith, right? So there's that. And then I think the other thing, I've said, is an expectation, perhaps in my case a slightly resigned expectation directed towards me, that this one is going to be the incompetent and the clever one, right? I mean, the sense that literary, intellectual, scientific life is indispensable, and that a very important element of the culture and the family is maintained through that, right? And that's a very familiar point about that kind of group, I think. So this kind of, I think, very interesting balance between membership and alienation, right? Because this was an extraordinarily assimilated generation, right? And on the other hand, a sense that the life of the mind was absolutely legitimate, probably indispensable, but for the minority, right? Not everyone was going to do that. Not everyone was going to go to university. Not everyone was going to get a university job, but I was a campus brat anyway, so it kind of followed.
I mean, there has been a great deal of speculation as to why a much larger than predicted percentage of Jewish people are represented in the sciences, particularly, and in the arts and so on in this country. And all sorts of theories are put forward. That sounds part of the answer, that there's always one or two who are, in a sense, pushed forward to do that. Are there other
and
reasons?
Also, I mean, I do want to emphasise this, that strange sociological mixture of pride and resigned tolerance, right? This is not a culture that heroises learning and the intellectual. On the contrary, I mean, a lot of the humour is entirely about the complete uselessness, incompetence and general catastrophe of intellectuals as any worthy members of society, right? I mean, that's one of the spines of Jewish wit. On the other hand, a sense that this is potentially a way up and out, right? So again, there's this rather interesting tension between absolute membership and slight alienation, right? That one accepts the idea that pursuing the intellectual career is one of the noblest things you can do, but it's a way out, right, from the culture that is validating it, right? This is how you get out of the ghetto. After all, this isn't how you stay within the ghetto. Not everybody can be a rabbi, right? I find that quite interesting. It's a ticket out of a culture that demands that you do this. So there's something very complicated and interesting going on there, I think.
What about the whole idea of the ghetto, in the sense that it's sometimes alleged that the push towards intellectual activities is partly because many other things are
forbidden.
I mean, you can't join the army, you can't do this and that.
I mean, I think historically that must be right, and that's clearly an absolutely crucial factor across a vast range of activities. But for the moment that we're thinking about now, that isn't in operation, right? Rather the other way around. Of course, there'll never be, one might have said, a captain of the England cricket team who's Jewish, because we actually don't know how to hold a ball, right? I mean, this physical incompetence is really important. I mean, obviously I'm clinging to that because as a kind of defence mechanism, but I do think it plays a role. It's also, to generalise wildly, it's also notoriously associated with the incredible tensions around Zionism that
around Zionism.
Yes,
Yep.
that were in play and remain, if not massively, more in play, right? My parents were always ambivalent at a period when I didn't know anyone in the family was about the Zionist project. And the identification between, as it were, Jewish intellectual and social life and support for Israel was unquestioned, except in our part of the family, right? And that became more and more complicated, I think, as the 60s and 70s went on. I went to Israel in what would now be known as my gap year, to the Hebrew University, and it was an amazing and eye-opening experience both ways, right? Both in terms of, I think, becoming better informed about what was happening in the Middle East at that period, but also completely disillusioning me, permanently, frankly, about the Zionist project. So, the reason I'm mentioning that is partly because Zionism, in interesting ways, after all, notoriously, wanted to break a certain kind of stereotype around the Jewish figure and to replace it with a more physical, more athletic, more militant, more virile image. That was part of the point. That was what Herzl was after in Vienna at the end of the 19th century. And that was obviously massively in tension with an image of urbanity and of the life of the mind. I mean, there was a huge tension there within the formation of Zionism and its various iconographies, right? And the idea of working on a kibbutz did not ever appeal, it has to be said. Not for ideological reasons at that stage, just because I couldn't imagine anything worse than getting up at 5 in the morning and picking oranges.
Which you never did.
Which I never did, no. And lots of people did. Lots and lots. Including non-Jewish people, one should remember. I mean, in the 60s through to the Yom Kippur War of 72, one could imagine idealistic volunteers from Europe going to Israel to work on a kibbutz, whether they were Jewish or not. That's a very interesting thing again to remember. All that is gone.
That was one of my plans when I left university.
Nice.
Fish farming on a kibbutz.
Right.
Just two further things about that very early period. One is you've spoken warmly about your grandparents on one side anyway. What about the personalities of your parents? How do you think that shaped? I mean, do they encourage you very much in reading or anything?
Oh yes, I mean they're the most important people in my life, and my father, who died in 1984, was very careful. They both were very careful not to be seen actively to direct me, right? Yet always to provide any resources that I needed. I was a ridiculously spoiled child, I mean ridiculously so. And I was the only child, and so on. And certainly the assumption that the good life consisted of music, books, long walks, and serious conversation was just absolutely taken for granted, completely pervasive, and one was treated like a grown-up from the get-go. So that, and my mother still, I think is extraordinary in this respect, that she is no respecter of rank or person and simply treats everyone in the same way, whoever they are, and that was a fundamental idea. And I hope I learned from that. I think I did learn from that. I mean, I don't think I followed it, but I certainly learned from it, right? So that interesting mixture of a kind of unmarked literary intellectual culture, right? Not saying this is how we live, not how they live, but this is how everyone lives. And a deeply principled egalitarianism. I mean, the snobbishness was the thing they loathed the most, I think, more than anything else. Right? And that in turn obviously related to lots of other issues like trying to see things from other people's points of view. Right? Think how it must seem to them. So most of this implicit, as I guess it is for most people, but absolutely indispensable, as I guess it is for most people too.
The second thing is about the first school. You said, it was very out of date and lots of copying and splodging of ink and things like that.
Right.
Were there any teachers or anyone, even at that stage, who were beginning to...
That's a very interesting question, isn't it? I like my teachers, and they were very good at their job. It's just that in retrospect I think it was the wrong job, and I can remember them all pretty well. In particular, one primary school teacher, Mrs. Flynn, the daughter of a flying doctor from Central Australia, initial T, that's T for trouble. And they were anything but inspirational. Right? It was very clear that they were not teaching these children so that these children would become like them. They were teaching these children in a very rigid and very robust curriculum, and then send them on to other things. That was at primary school, right? In 1965 we came back to Britain, a different universe, and a very different school, in fact. So what should one say about that?
What was the school?
Well, before I get onto the school, I guess one has to think about why we came back. We have the Robbins Report, the expansion of British universities, the coming to power of the Labour government in '64, and I think, again, much of this is in retrospect, the very remarkable return to or arrival in Britain of a very significant cohort of formerly expatriate intellectuals. Right? So one of the new universities was Sussex. Sussex set up an Institute of Development Studies. They offered a job to my father. He took it. We moved to Brighton. And they stayed in Brighton from then on. And that's where I went to secondary school. Unrecognisably different experience, of course. Starting with the fact that the beach had no sand. Right? That was the first thing, if you'll pardon the expression, that hit me, to such an extent that I thought that the English must have dumped vast amounts of pebbles for no obvious reason on this beach, right? And the usual remarks about the weather and so on. Living in a rather chilly house before we moved into a proper one, and opposite the secondary school. We came back then when I was 10, right? Still had the 11 plus regime in Brighton, so this was the summer of 1965, and I was therefore 10 and a half. Question, should I go to primary school and then take the 11 plus, or should I go straight to secondary school? So I was taken to an educational psychologist who asked me the usual questions about, you're provided with 3 pint pots and a quart of water, how do you get 4 1/4 pints? And so on. And apparently I answered all those questions correctly and was sent straight to grammar school, Varndine Grammar School for Boys, as it then was. So, a single-sex school.
What's it called?
Varndine.
Varndine.
Varndean.
Yeah.
The only distinguished old boys are Paul Schofield and Steve Ovett, who was a contemporary of mine and a brilliant athlete, otherwise not a very nice man. And
is that to go on the internet?
why not? and Natasha Kaplinski, who was there long after me. And it was a very good grammar school. It was ridiculously selective. It was single sex. One wore ferociously policed uniforms, including caps, right? Embarrassingly. There were prefects, there were houses, there were gowns for the teachers, there was Latin, there was amazingly intense teaching of, I realise, a very high order indeed. And we lived opposite the school, so I thought that was great, right? So from a rather early age I could come home for lunch, since that meant avoiding school dinners, which was one of the great victories of my life, right? And these were semolina and so on. I was accelerated through the school, so I missed out the fifth form. So I took O-levels, as they then were, when I was 14, and A-levels when I was 16. And what should one say about that? Several of the teachers were completely inspirational for me. Especially the teacher of mathematics, Ron Woolner, whom I wish here to commemorate, who was a descendant of Thomas Woolner, the great Victorian artist and sculptor, who painted The Last of England, right? Or who rather is in The Last of England, right? I didn't paint it. And whom I subsequently discovered has a bust of Whewell in Trinity. Anyway, his descendant taught me mathematics, and he was fantastic. I mean, he absolutely inspired me. And a remark that one might want to think about there, I thought myself correctly very bad at arithmetic. And he sat me down one day and said, mathematics is not arithmetic. And he talked to me for about half an hour on my own about the difference between mathematics in terms of these elegant and beautiful manipulations of signs and arithmetic, which is 2 times 4. Right? And the fact that I was rather bad at sums had nothing to do with whether I was going to be any good as a mathematician. And that was completely amazing. I mean, no one had ever said that or spent that much time saying that with me before. Similarly, I have to say the English teacher, Mr. Cunningham, was magnificent in the way that really good English teachers can be. That is to say, letting people work at their own speed and level, but spotting people who could read quite fast and not exactly ordering them to read stuff, but as it were, laying out in front of them the lily pads for them to jump on, right? He was really good at that. And he encouraged us to start our own drama club independently of the rather formal classical school drama club, right? So alongside the annual play, almost always either Shakespeare or something, we could do other things. Plays by John Arden, for example. I mean, 60s playwrights, in other words. That was great. But all of this happening in, once again, institution entirely out of time. After all, this is the late 60s in Brighton. Right? This is the Who. The Isle of Wight Festival happens when I'm 13, and I knew lots of people were hitching from Brighton to the Isle of Wight to see Hendrix or whatever, and that was light years from the world of this very conservative, but I think brilliantly administered and taught grammar school. I mean, there was a real sense of two worlds with almost nothing to do with each other, right? And I left when I was 16. The other aspect of it, which is important for this story, is that with my father's rather special and enthusiastic support, I did science, right? So for my O-levels, I did the O-levels in subjects I wasn't going to go on with. And then I did A-levels in physics and chemistry and maths in the sixth form. And my father was delighted by this because he was an unquestioning admirer of the sciences, was delighted that his son was going to be a scientist, and would therefore escape all the problems of humanities and social knowledge and so on, and learn how to make true discoveries about true facts of reliable and useful kind, unlike the stuff that he was doing. So I didn't realise that at the time. I didn't realise how much enthusiasm there was, right, for this course that I was taking. But in retrospect, I realised when they were over the moon that I was actually going to do science.
Were there, you've mentioned that you're not very good with catching balls and things like this, but were there any kind of outdoor?
Well, I played hockey for the school and was a pretty good defender, right? Because being sort of squat and fairly strong around the shoulders, I guess, I was very good at that. Until I got a hockey stick between the eyes, right, and many stitches, and that sort of damaged my confidence a bit about going into a tackle. My mother remembers the horror with which she was phoned up from school and told Simon's in hospital and he has blood pouring from a gash, over his nose, right? That was a rather bad moment. And there was a lot of swimming because I was from Australia, and you swim, right? Much more than English people do. And there was chess, lots of chess, which is not really a physical sport, but you have to be able to move the pieces around.
Do you still play it?
And there was...
How good are you?
Not that good, right?
Swinnerton Dyer was very good at whatever
Yes.
it was that he played of that kind.
Yeah, no, I lost it completely, I think. And there was a lot of music, right? Flute, guitar, that sort of thing.
You played those?
Yeah. But all rather kind of inconsequentially, right? It was just fun. And it was a way of meeting people, right? It breaks the ice at parties, I think.
Has music meant much
Yes,
to you in your life?
enormously, right? I mean, in various ways, because, it's the thing that brings tears to my eyes, right, still. And it's, I think, one of the few ways, live music is one of the few ways in which I think we really and truly get together in groups to do something that's really meaningful and actually has really strong aesthetic effects. And it's also been very interesting to think with. It's a source of metaphor, I think, that we perhaps don't use enough in my part of the world. Collaboration, collective playing, to follow a score, to think about how composition works. These have been actually quite important themes for me to reflect on when I'm trying to think about where creativity comes from, or how a discovery is made, or what it is to work in a group. I'm thinking about music quite often when I'm thinking about that.
Are you listening to music quite
Yeah,
often?
all the time. It drives my partner completely crazy. She doesn't understand how anyone can do that. So when I'm writing or reading, I have to have sound, and typically it has to be music. Right? I find silence very disturbing.
What music is it?
Oh, almost any kind. It's absurdly eclectic, right? It's often now, as I've got old, autobiographical, so it's music that has a particular association. It's another thing one might say about music, that it brings memory to presence more effectively than anything else. So I like listening to tracks that remind me of a place I was when I first heard that, or when I last heard it. Right. So yeah, I mean, I can't work without that sound.
Is it classical or?
A lot of it is
jazz?
classical. Most of it is now jazz. Right. I mean, jazz is like I don't know, aubergines or garlic. It's something I just can't imagine having liked when I was younger, and now I can't do without it. And it keeps me healthy insofar as I am.
And classical what?
Well, that's family, really. I mean, my taste in classical music is my parents' taste. So Mahler and Beethoven and the German classical tradition, up to and including Richard Strauss. And my own taste initially was in early music, actually, when I was at Cambridge as a student. And I sort of lost that slightly and gone back to my father's music, you know, great Mahler symphonies booming away there somewhere in the background on ridiculously expensive speakers.
I've noticed that film editors often edit to music. They did that in the series we were both involved with. And that's to give their writing an actual pace. And it said that, for instance, Maitland's writing, you can see, has been analysed musically. That and he was often used to hum and sing when he was writing.
Oh, right.
Do you think all this music in the background ever has any sort of more direct effect on what you're...
I hope so. I mean, it would be immodest to say that it does. Writing is the moment when I have ideas, insofar as I have any. And therefore, it's kind of complex to pick the bones out of that. So, insofar as I've had any original ideas at all, they've happened while I'm at a keyboard, listening to music, rather than in quiet repose or while thinking of something else, right? I find that moments of intense concentration on the problem at hand, surrounded, as it were, cocooned, if rather, by all the elements of the problem, are what produces anything like an innovative approach to the problem that one's trying to work out. So there's a kind of exteriority to problem solving there that it's almost literally manipulating material on the page or the screen now, while the auditory environment is simultaneously blanking out everything else, right? So it's a lens, right? It focuses. And yet at the same time it's clearly providing something rhythmic for this sort of concentrated reflection. It's quite hard to work out exactly what that is. Right? I think it's not uncommon for people to use that kind of environment both as a resource and as an insulation, right? And certainly is for me.
Yeats said that his poetry, when he was asked, he said, "My poetry is in the tip of my pen." That moment when you put the two together, the paper and the pen.
Yes, I think that's...
But quite a lot of scientists I've talked to, and Weber himself, he said, "I never have any of my ideas at my desk. You know, I create the problem and the data is collected there, and then I go for a walk or something." So your description is not
universal. Well, if the choice is between Yeatsian pen tips and Weberian meditative walks elsewhere, I'm on Yeats's side, unusually, right? Because I have very little experience of flashes of insight. I mean, it is 99% perspiration, I think.
But have you had this experience that when you start in the morning to write, you don't really know what you're going to write, and then as you write, ideas come.
Absolutely.
And by the end of the day, someone says, "What have you written today?" And you say, "I don't know." until I read it.
Yes. No, absolutely.
As
I have
if
had
it
that.
just comes from outside.
Yeah, no. I mean, absolutely. That I've one's had the experience of the demon, right? But that's wrapped up with one of the techniques which I fairly religiously stick to, which is that I must not, I've discovered, perfectly finish a piece of writing in the evening. Because if I then return to it in the morning, I find restarting incredibly difficult. So I think that's strongly related to the idea of working on the page or on the screen rather than elsewhere. That the incomplete row of bricks shows you how to go on for a bit, so that you arrive in the morning and there's an incomplete row of bricks, and you know rather mechanically at least how to finish that off, and then you're in the swing, right? Whereas if I come back in the morning and I've sort of got a perfectly finished little bit of wall, I'm slightly at a pause because I don't know how to go on, right? So I would strongly recommend, it's a really important piece of information, don't polish off in the evening, right? One should take a break in medias res, I think.
This is something I learned from local historian W.G. Hoskins.
Right.
He says he makes it on a rather larger scale. In other words, if you've been writing all week, don't finish it then, because when you come back on Monday morning, it'll be really cold. And
absolutely right. At least that is my experience. Because nothing is alienated from you quicker than this text that you allegedly wrote. It becomes very difficult to go back into the work that you're involved in. And I think, if I think back to when I was a science undergraduate, it was much the same, right? That's to say, problems were more easily solved as part of the work, rather than looking at this perfectly finished thing and then trying to see if you could improve it. That didn't seem to work at all.
How many times, since we're on this sort of creating work topic, do you draft and redraft and redraft?
Yeah. No, I'm an obsessive rewriter and a very bad cutter. So that one can always easily think of what needs expansion, rendering more explicit, developing, and so on. As a result of which, at least professionally, the work is organised into 18,500 word long bits. Right? I find it amazingly difficult to say anything in less than that, and very difficult to string several of these together, right? So, to use the old-fashioned musical analogy, these are EPs, these are extended plays, they aren't singles, and they're not really albums, they're this rather unsatisfactory middle range object, which I just work on. There are large cardboard boxes in which I tragically fail to throw away each successive draft, and I have a kind of clear out and start again.
Why do you say tragically?
Well, because they just, in terms of stratigraphy, it's a bit complicated, and also in terms of the amount of space it takes up in the house, it's even worse.
You referred to when you were a scientist. Do you, having been both at quite a high level, and not having been a scientist, is the process of creativity and discovery very, very different in the two, or not?
Well, I wasn't ever a scientist at a high level, but I met several scientists who were scientists at the highest level. And I suspect that processes of creativity don't respect disciplinary boundaries. That would be the first thing to say, that there actually are things one can generally say about how folk invent and innovate and create that are probably not systematically different between, making a poem and making a theory and maybe even making an experiment, and that at least I hope there are some general things one can say about that, because that's been part of my work. I think there are some obvious, as it were, systematic and institutional differences which are very, very interesting, especially in our culture now, right? And perhaps the most interesting one is the one to do with the tools of the trade. After all, from one point of view, I guess you could say that if you look like a Martian at the workspace of people working in, say, the University of Cambridge, and you didn't know what they were working on, you couldn't tell whether they were doing history or astrophysics, because they all look as though they're doing the same thing. They all look as though they're at a keyboard in front of a screen.
Isn't this a recent thing?
And it's a very recent development, and it's, I think, still, in interesting ways, an underanalyzed one. That's to say, at the very moment when people speak about more and more specialization, more and more disciplinary boundaries, more and more, exquisitely distinguished sub-specialties, the phenomenology of this sort of work has become more and more similar for larger and larger groups of people, and not just people who work within the academy, of course, in fact, absolutely not just people who work within the academy. So one can talk of the military entertainment complex, right, as some of my best colleagues like Tim Lenoir do, where skills at pattern recognition on the screen with a keyboard move across from the most heterogeneous areas, from Game Boy to nuclear war, right? From simulacra to reality. That's one line one might want to pursue. But if one's trying to think, what is the work folk are doing when they are being creative, if you try, as it were, to identify what that work is, by and large, the manual, practical, material aspects of it have converged massively in the second half of the last century. You go back to the immediate pre-Second World War period, we could not have said this.
Yeah, Cavendish looked rather different.
Right, at all. Right? You know the difference between, as it were, Rutherford's boys and Trevelyan's boys. You would know that difference, and now you don't. Right? At least not if you're a Martian, and you don't ask them what they're doing. Right?
Yeah.
So, perversely, and I think ironically, reflection on creativity across various disciplinary boundaries might, from that point of view, have become interestingly easier, right? Because one's dealing with some bits and pieces of practical behaviour which have got more and more similar over the last 50 to 60 years. I think that's actually quite an interesting issue, right? Certainly in the science with which I'm most familiar, which is astronomy. So that actually there ought to be, whether there are robust principles that help us to understand creativity, there ought to be robust principles that deal with what it's like having smart new thoughts that work when you're a typist at the cinema, which is the standard situation of almost all workers and intellectuals in this culture now, right? In this little restricted culture.
Let's pursue that in more detail next time that we talk. We've just got 3 minutes on this tape, is it? And you're still at school. You're about 16. Is there anything more that should be said about the school, or shall we move on to the? Had a gap.
Let's move on. So the system in those days was, if you were thinking of going or applying to Oxbridge, which I was going to apply to Cambridge to read natural sciences. you stayed on for one extra term, right? So this is the autumn of 1971, right? And it was called, this really situates my school perfectly, it was called the upper bench, right? Lower sixth, upper bench, okay. And you did entrance exams in December of that year, and I got an exhibition to Trinity, which I was amazed by. And then I had, therefore, from December of 71 until October of 72 to do what I wanted.